can circulate in this area, but it's going to have to end up back at the fourth ventricle so that it can get into the subarachnoid space through the median aperture or the two lateral apertures. Remember that this lumen, this passageway, is lined by ependymal cells. So they have those cilia that help to circulate the cerebrospinal fluid. Now that basic pattern we see again is some sort of lumen. We have the central canal of the spinal cord surrounded by gray matter, which is then surrounded by superficially by white matter. So this is going to be our gray matter, and that gray matter takes on that H-shaped or butterfly-shaped pattern. And then outside is going to be the white matter, which is organized into tracts, or also known as fasciculi. And those tracts or fasciculi, we're going to see, Leslie's going to talk to you guys about those this afternoon in the additional spinal cord lecture. Well, if we look at those H-shaped butterfly pattern of that gray matter, remember that gray matter has unmyelinated axons, dendrites, lots of neuroglia associated with them, but a lot of neuronal cell bodies. And what we see is that that H shape is very organized, and it has horns associated with it. These are known as horns. And some of those horns are anterior horns, and some of them are posterior horns. And we need to be able to figure out which is which. Well, that means we need to know which is the anterior side and which is the posterior side. Well, if I was a much better artist, I could draw in the vertebrae. And if I drew in the vertebrae, you would see that the spinous process would be posterior, and you would see that the body would be anterior. So that's one way you can figure out the anterior side from the posterior side. But we don't have that here. We don't have the bone associated with this particular drawing, so we need to look at other structures. The first thing that we notice is that on one side we have a little divot, and on the other side we have a very much larger indentation. What do we call these little tiny dips?
Sulci?
Sulci. So those are sulci. And this sulcus that we see right here is along the midline. So it's a median sulcus, and that median sulcus is found posteriorly. That is known as the posterior median sulcus. That's the posterior median sulcus. On the other side, we have a much bigger dip, much deeper dip, and we would call those what?
Fissures.
Fissures. So that's on the anterior side, so it's the anterior median fissure. So now we know which side is which, so we can start labeling our horns. And so now we know that this is going to be as well as this. These are the posterior or dorsal horns. On the opposite side, we're going to have the anterior or ventral horns. Okay? Well, in those horns, we know we have a lot of neuronal cell bodies. And those horns, understanding where they are is important because they're going to divide functionally the role of these neuron cell bodies that we find in there. So if we look in the posterior horns, these posterior horns are going to contain, does anybody remember, based on function, what those are? The motor, or the sensory, or the interneurons?
Motor.
Posterior. Interneurons. So we have lots of interneuron cell bodies. I'm going to draw 5 on each side. And so these are representing interneurons or association neurons. On the opposite side, do you remember functionally what these guys are on the anterior or ventral horns?
Motor.
They're motor neurons. There's hundreds, there's thousands. I'm going to draw you 5 cell bodies. These are the cell bodies of our motor or efferent neurons. Well, connected to the central nervous system is the peripheral nervous system. And so we come away from the peripheral nervous system, we now see that we have these two collections of axons. And these collections of axons are going to be, and we know which side's which, so this is going to be the, what do you think this is?
Ventral root.
This is the ventral root. See that on both sides. In the back, we have the
Dorsal root.
dorsal root. That's all dorsal root. The ventral root and the dorsal root come together in the intervertebral foramina to form what?
Spinal nerve.
Spinal nerve. Spinal nerve comes out, divides, and the two major branches are the, you remember? Dorsal and ventral rami. So this is going to be your ventral ramus. This is going to be your dorsal ramus. Anybody have any questions on the pieces and parts? Or we now connect the axons. Hello. Okay, so just reminding you of the sides that we have. We know that this is the sulcus, so this is the posterior side or dorsal side. This is going to be your anterior side or ventral side. We've seen two ways that we can determine which is which. One being if the bone was there, we don't have that. Second is the sulcus versus the fissure. Fissure is on the anterior side, sulcus is on the posterior side. We start labeling things. We know that we have on both sides then our ventral root and our dorsal root. We have our spinal nerve. We have our dorsal ramus and our ventral ramus. That's on both sides. And then we have our posterior horns and our anterior horns. And the posterior horns, remember posterior horns, asking again what neurons based on function are in the posterior horns?
Interneurons.
Interneurons. Oop, we want to move that one. There's hundreds, there's thousands. only have time to draw you 5. And in the ventral root, based on function, what do we have?
Motor neurons.
Motor neurons. Structurally, both look the same. What are they? Are they bipolar, multipolar, or unipolar?
Multipolar.
Multipolar, good. So if you took a section of these and you looked and went, oh, I don't know, you know, these are both multipolar, you would know functionally what they do just based on their location. If they're back here in the posterior dorsal horn, they're interneurons. They're shuttling information around the central nervous system. If they're on the anterior side, they're going to be motor or efferent. They're going to be sending information out to skeletal muscle. So let's think about that. Let's say that I want to move, and let's say that this is going to be right and this is going to be left. I want to move my left upper limb, and I want to go ahead and do flexion. And what's our main flexor of the elbow? Brachialis. So we want to turn on my corticospinal area, corticospinal tract by sending information down that by turning on some motor or some neurons associated with the primary motor cortex on my right side. So I can do this. So primary motor cortex, we're going to turn on some neurons, and we're going to send some information down the corticospinal tract. It's going to cross over at the pyramids. It's going to come down the corticospinal tract, and at a certain level, that which goes into the brachial plexus, we're going to see some motor neurons are activated. And those motor neurons, during embryonic development, develop so that their axon will go out the ventral root into the spinal nerve. And if they're going to end up going to the through the brachial plexus and going into the brachialis muscle, muscle, are they going to take the dorsal ramus or the ventral ramus?
Ventral.
Ventral ramus, good. All the way out to that skeletal muscle. And typically it's not just one motor unit that's going to be turned on, it's going to be multiple. I just have time to draw you one of those, but you can see how that information then can go all the way out to the skeletal muscle cells. Well, what if somebody goes ahead and touches my upper limb? Well, I want to be aware of that. So that information has to go back to my central nervous system so I become aware of it. So I have receptors in my upper limb that are going to gain that information, and we're going to send that information back through the ventral ramus from those receptors, through the ventral ramus, through the spinal nerve, through the dorsal root, and into the spinal cord. And they may synapse on this interneuron, they may cross over first and synapse on an interneuron, but the point is that that sensory information is coming in and synapsing on one of these interneurons, and then those interneurons are going to carry that information up to the brain, specifically up to the thalamus. First to the thalamus for a nice synapse or two, then to the primary sensory cortex, which is along the post-central gyrus, and if we're talking left upper limb, we're talking right post-central gyrus, okay? Crisscrossing sides, okay? Sometimes the synapse is on this side, sometimes the synapse is on the other side, but these interneurons are going to end up creating tracts that are going to be ascending tracts or sensory tracts. So this red neuron we see coming back, this is showing you a sensory neuron bringing information back. It's bringing back general sensation from the upper limb. So functionally, it's a sensory or an afferent neuron. Sensory or afferent neuron. Structurally, does anybody remember what those are?
Unipolar.
They're unipolar. So somewhere we have to have their cell body. If you notice, there's this little bulge on the dorsal root. In here are the cell bodies of these unipolar sensory neurons. So this is a collection of neuronal cell bodies which are found in the peripheral nervous system. collection of neuronal cell bodies found in the peripheral nervous system is called what?
Ganglia.
Ganglion. So this is known as the dorsal root ganglion. The DRG, the dorsal root ganglion. And that will be sitting in the intervertebral foramen as well with the spinal nerve for its protection. So remember, you want to make sure that you protect those neuronal cell bodies. Well, if you notice, there's a ganglion on the dorsal root, but there's not one on the ventral root because the ventral root's axons have their cell bodies back in the anterior horns. So remember I said there's three ways to try to figure out if you're looking at the anterior side or posterior side. The first way we described is if the bone was there. If we were looking at the bone, would the body of the vertebrae be on the anterior side or the posterior side? Body of the vertebrae, which side? Anterior side. So the body of the vertebrae would be here, and the spinous process would be back here. You can feel the spinous process is going down the midline of somebody's back. Second way is looking at the sulcus versus the fissure. Third thing is, if you got the peripheral nervous system attached to it, you can look, and if you find the dorsal root ganglion, it's called the dorsal root ganglion because it's on the dorsal side. So that's giving you a third way to try to figure out which side's which. The nice thing about drawing it out, I mean, I'm just showing you one neuron, but there's multiple neurons doing that, but you can see the division of labor that gets set up. Your ventral root is going to be motor only, and you can visualize that. So information is only going that direction. Your dorsal root is sensory only. Information coming in. Spinal nerve, you now can see it is mixed. And what we'll see is the dorsal ramus and the ventral ramus are also mixed. And you can visualize that now. Well, let's say that somebody comes and taps the middle of my back on my left side. Maybe we're in this area right here. I want to be aware of that. So I have sensory neurons that are going to send information back to the central nervous system. So we're coming from the back. Well, if we're coming from the back then, and that 3-inch strip down the middle of the back, those sensory neurons come through the dorsal ramus, through the spinal nerve, through the dorsal root, and come in and can synapse on an inner neuron, either on this side or that side. Sometimes they cross over right away. Other times they cross over a little bit later. Don't forget this is a unipolar sensory neuron, so it has its cell body back here. Action potential goes right past that cell body and is heading towards that inner neuron. Say that because somebody touched my back, I want to activate my erector spinae complex. So when I come from the erector, to get to the erector spinae complex, I'm going to activate my primary motor cortex, and we're going to see that we end up activating some interneurons, some motor neurons that have sent their axon during embryonic development out the ventral root into the spinal nerve. And if I'm going to the erector spinae complex, I'm heading back through the dorsal ramus out to the skeletal muscle cells. So again, you can see that separation of labor even here with the dorsal ramus. It's mixed, 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 sensory only, motor only.
What did you write up there?
Skeletal muscle cell. Does anybody have any questions? And again, I've only drawn one neuron out, one neuron in, but again, typically you're activating multiple out and activating multiple in as well. Okay, give me 2 minutes to set up the projector. Anybody have any questions before I put this away? Skeletal muscle cells. So that's going to skeletal muscle cells, and this is coming from receptors. and very often it's the sort of the end of those neurons, those sensory neurons that are the receptors. Give me a minute to get this put away. Okay, who's tall? Who's the tallest in the room?
I think it's, I don't know if it's
Not
Khadijah, are you really the tallest one?
I might need a
Caleb, I wanna see you.
Wow, that is still so, oh my gosh, wow,
Thank you.
I'm a midget. Oh yeah, Debbie, I got your email. Thank you for sending the video. I appreciate it. Do you know what shade it is? I thought we were in the continuous spinal.
I think it's continued spinal.
I'm just gonna give you a couple more, well, we went through these slides already, but now that you've seen the drawing, I wanna make sure that everybody's still comfortable with these pictures.
But I'll still send it.
Okay, so here's that basic patterning we saw with the cross-section of the spinal cord. We can see that here's the central canal of the spinal cord, very small, lined with those ependymal cells. Here's our gray matter and that butterfly-shaped pattern with the horns. And then superficially, we have the white matter organized into tracts or fasciculi. You can see the posterior median sulcus. You can see the anterior median fissure. That lets you know which side is which, and so we know these are the dorsal horns. Or sorry, these are the ventral horns, and then back here we have the dorsal horns. And so we know functionally those neurons in those areas, what they're doing. Central canal of the spinal cord lined with the ependymal cells with the cilia. Remember, the central canal of the spinal cord is connected to the fourth ventricle, and that's the way out into the subarachnoid space. What Leslie's going to talk to you guys about this afternoon is what's happening with all of that white matter, and the white matter organized into tract or fasciculi. And so remember, you have ascending or sensory tracts, which carry sensory information towards the brain, and then you have the descending motor tracts, which are pathways carrying information down. They're showing you the motor tracts in red, and the sensory in the blue. The blue is on both sides, the red is on both sides, you've just split it based on division of labor. This picture should make a lot more sense now. In this particular unit, we're ignoring the yellow. We're gonna pick that up in the next unit, in the first lecture on the autonomic nervous system. But you can see that back here in the posterior horns, we have our interneurons that are gonna send their axons into tracts or fasciculi that are sensory or ascending tracts up to the thalamus for a nice synapse or two, and then to the postcentral gyrus so you become aware of sensation. Back here or in the front, in the anterior horns are going to be the cell bodies of our motor neurons that are going to send their axons out the ventral root into the spinal nerves and out to skeletal muscles to control. Remember, information is coming into the back of the spinal cord through these unipolar sensory neurons that have their cell bodies in the dorsal root ganglion. That picture should make a lot more sense than it did last time we talked about it. So we saw that through this activity here, we actually created spinal nerves here and here. 31 times on one side, 31 times on the other side. And we know that there's 8 cervical, 12 thoracic, 5 lumbar, 5 sacral, and 1 coccygeal. And that spinal nerve is formed from the union of the dorsal root and the ventral root. And we now understand sort of the division of labor that we have associated with each one of those. Those roots, when they form, actually start off as little rootlets, which come off the spinal cord, and then form the roots. So we can see the dorsal roots and the ventral roots. And you can see that in the actual dissection here. Here's the little rootlets that are coming off, and you'll see this in the laboratory. So the dorsal, and so now the nice thing is in this particular image, they're showing you the bone. So remember, if you see the body of the vertebrae, that's gonna show you that the anterior side, spinous process is the posterior side. You can also see the fissure versus the sulcus. You can also see a dorsal root versus no root on the ventral root, or no ganglion on the ventral root. So those are different things you can look for to figure out which side is which. Anybody have any questions? Okay, so let's talk about special sensation. Why don't you guys take like 3 minutes, stand up and stretch, and we'll start talking about it. Yeah.
You said 3 minutes?
3 minutes.
You got 3 whole minutes.
To go all the way to the bistro?
You want this Red Bull? Did I send you the wrong one?
No, you sent me the right one, but that one Leslie's right.
Oh.
So.
Special sentence. Yeah.
Oh,
I think, you know, first part of spinal, we'll get spinal, so we're gonna do tracks of Leslie. Yes.
Are we doing the second spinal cord tracks?
Leslie's gonna do that with you guys this afternoon.
What do you have for
Did you say, oh, I thought you said being medley.
Nice. That you did.